I think I didn't do anything wrong, just a small tribute to someone from my past. But the moment my husband realized our baby's middle name matched my ex's, his eyes shattered. He broke before the test results ever arrived, and the silence that followed was worse than any scream. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The hospital room was warm, the walls painted in pale yellow meant to soothe nerves, yet all I felt was a rush of triumph as I filled in the final line on the birth certificate. Clara Adrian Calvin. The name looked perfect to me, elegant and balanced, the kind of name that carried meaning. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that middle names were often just flourishes, that nobody would really care what it meant to me. But when Tom leaned over my shoulder and read the words, I saw his jaw tighten, the color drain from his face. He asked why I had chosen Adrian, his voice steady but sharp. I told him immediately that it was just a name I liked, that it sounded strong, timeless, that it fit beautifully. He didn't reply, but his silence felt heavier than any argument. I smiled as if nothing was wrong, holding Clara closer, convincing myself he would get used to it. Later, when his parents came to visit, Margaret leaned down to read the certificate. Her lips tightened the moment she saw the middle name, and she looked at Tom instead of me. Paul tried to smooth the moment, saying Clara was beautiful no matter what, but Margaret asked directly if Adrian was the same name as my ex-boyfriend. My heart skipped, but I laughed it off quickly, insisting it was coincidence, that Adrian was a common name, and only a paranoid person would make such a leap. I even teased Tom, saying he must have told his mother already, that he was gossiping about nothing. His silence deepened, his eyes fixed on the floor, while Margaret's stare burned into me. I kept smiling, pretending the tension didn't exist, telling myself that if I acted confident enough, everyone else would seem unreasonable. When Naomi visited later that evening, I confided in her that Tom was sulking over the name. She laughed, saying men always got insecure over silly things, that I was right to stand by my choice. Her laughter was the validation I needed, and I repeated my defense with more certainty. Adrian was just a name. Clara Adrian Calvin was elegant, sophisticated, better than the plain suggestions Tom had offered. I told myself it wasn't betrayal, it was taste, and if he couldn't see that, it was his problem. Naomi assured me no one would take it seriously, that Tom would calm down once the baby settled into routine. I believed her, soaking in the reassurance like water on dry soil. Back at home, things grew colder. Tom avoided direct conversations, slipping into the nursery at night instead of our bedroom, keeping his focus entirely on Clara. He fed her, rocked her, changed her, but rarely spoke to me. When he did, his words were clipped, short, polite but distant. I tried to tease him, asking if he was still mad about a middle name, laughing as if his silence was childish. I told him he should be grateful I hadn't picked something outrageous, that Adrian was classic. He didn't respond, just turned his attention back to Clara, humming softly to her as though my words weren't worth acknowledging. The lack of argument unsettled me more than shouting would have. I told myself he was sulking, that eventually he would break the silence, and when he did, I would have the upper hand. At the first family dinner since Clara's birth, the name was brought up again. Margaret asked pointedly why I hadn't considered Tom's family names, why I hadn't honored tradition. I smiled, saying tradition was overrated, that I wanted something modern, that Adrian sounded refined. Paul tried again to soften the tension, but Margaret pressed harder, asking why I had ignored Tom's discomfort. I laughed loudly, accusing her of being controlling, of wanting to name my child herself. Naomi, who had come with me for support, chimed in with a laugh, saying men and their mothers always acted like naming rights were sacred property. The table grew quiet, except for my laughter, which I made louder to fill the silence. Tom set his fork down gently, wiped his mouth, and stood without a word. He lifted Clara from her high chair and announced he was leaving. His voice was steady, calm, with no edge of anger. The calmness made the room colder than if he had shouted. I tried to call after him that he was embarrassing himself, that people would think he was overreacting. He didn't respond. Margaret shook her head, muttering that I had gone too far, while Paul simply sighed, staring into his plate. Naomi whispered to me that Tom was just being dramatic, but her voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. I smiled tightly, raising my glass as if nothing had happened, insisting to those still at the table that Tom had always been too sensitive. Yet when I drove home later, the empty parking space in the driveway told me he had gone somewhere else for the night. I paced the living room, convincing myself he was punishing me unfairly, that he was trying to make me feel guilty over a choice that wasn't even wrong. I whispered to myself that Adrian was just a name, repeating it again and again until I almost believed it. But each time I passed the framed copy of Clara's birth certificate on the mantel, my stomach twisted at the way Tom had stared at it in silence. I poured a glass of wine and sat down on the couch, telling myself this was still my story to control, that I hadn't lost anything yet. Still, in the quiet of the house, with Clara asleep in her crib and no sound from Tom, the silence felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite laugh away. At the clinic, I tried to act like nothing had happened, as if the tension at home didn't exist, as if Tom's silence wasn't gnawing at me. I smiled at co-workers, made jokes at the front desk, and even showed off Clara's birth certificate with pride. I pointed out her name like it was something refined, modern, proof that I had better taste than anyone else. But the moment one of the nurses saw the middle name, her eyebrow lifted in that knowing way that made my stomach clench. She asked casually if Tom had been the one to pick it. I laughed loudly, saying no, that Adrian was my choice, that Tom wasn't very creative. Her glance shifted, and I could almost hear the unspoken question, wasn't Adrian the name of my ex? I laughed again, louder, saying Adrian was common, that people were ridiculous to connect it with anything else. Yet I caught the way her whisper followed her back down the hallway, and I knew the story was already spreading. By the time Naomi visited later that evening, she had already heard the gossip. She told me not to worry, that everyone was just bored, that they needed something to talk about. I told her Tom was sulking, sleeping in the nursery, refusing to look me in the eye. She laughed, saying men loved to punish their wives with silence, that I was right to stand firm. Her encouragement gave me fuel, so I told her I would never apologize for a choice that was mine to make. Adrian was elegant, classic, better than the plain names Tom's family suggested. Naomi nodded, sipping her wine, but her eyes flickered when I admitted Tom's mother had already accused me directly. Naomi brushed it off, saying mothers-in-law always blame their daughters-in-law, but even she looked a little uneasy. The next family dinner made everything worse. I showed up determined to keep my head high, Clara on my hip, her certificate copy tucked into my bag, as though displaying it might silence them. Margaret barely greeted me, her eyes sharp, her smile tight. Paul offered me a polite hello, but his tone carried weariness, as though he expected a fight. Tom barely said a word. He set Clara in her seat, cut her food into small pieces, and avoided looking at me completely. Margaret wasted no time. She asked in front of everyone why I had chosen Adrian, if I thought it was fair to drag old relationships into my daughter's life. I laughed loudly, saying Adrian was a name like any other, that she was paranoid for even asking. Naomi, sitting beside me, chuckled in agreement, saying some people love to invent drama. But Margaret didn't laugh. She said firmly that Tom had carried the shame of that name long before I put it on paper, that everyone who knew about my past would connect it instantly. Her words hit the table like a stone, silencing even Paul. I snapped that she had always hated me, that she wanted to control me, that this was just another excuse. My laughter grew louder, brittle, covering the unease crawling under my skin. Naomi tried to joke that I was simply modern, but the humor felt hollow. Tom sat still, silent, cutting food into tiny squares for Clara, his face calm but unreadable. The calmness unnerved me more than any outburst. I accused him of telling his mother everything, of running to her like a child, of trying to humiliate me. He didn't answer, didn't even flinch. He just reached for Clara when she fussed and soothed her gently, as though I wasn't even there. The silence stretched until finally he placed his napkin on the table, lifted Clara into his arms, and announced that they were leaving. His voice was steady, low, carrying no anger, but the weight of it chilled me. He walked out, his parents watching, Naomi blinking in shock beside me. I tried to laugh it off, claiming he was dramatic, that he loved to storm out and play the victim. Margaret leaned across the table, her voice sharp as a blade, saying this wasn't drama, this was betrayal. I shot back that she was twisting everything, that Tom was paranoid, that I had done nothing wrong, but even Paul's side told me they weren't buying it. Naomi murmured under her breath that I shouldn't let them get to me, but the way she shifted in her seat told me she was no longer certain. Back at my apartment later, Naomi tried to reassure me again, but her words had lost their confidence. She said Tom might just need time, that maybe it wasn't worth the fight. I snapped at her, accusing her of doubting me, of letting them manipulate her too. She raised her hands, telling me she was only trying to help. I poured another glass of wine, pacing the living room, muttering that everyone was against me because I had dared to make a choice without asking permission. Naomi sat silently, staring at her glass, and in that silence, I felt a crack in her loyalty. When she finally left, I was alone with the echo of my own voice. I stared at the copy of Clara's birth certificate on the mantel, at the name Adrian in bold black letters. I whispered to myself that it was just a name, that Tom was paranoid, that everyone else was exaggerating. But the longer I looked at the paper, the less certain I felt. The silence of the house pressed in, heavier than before, and for the first time I wondered if Tom's calmness meant he was already planning something I couldn't laugh away. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Clara crying, but Tom was already there, rocking her gently in the nursery while humming a tune. I stood in the doorway, watching him, expecting at least a glance in my direction, some acknowledgement that I was still her mother. Instead, he focused entirely on Clara, his expression soft for her, but distant toward me. I tried to joke, saying she liked my name choice more than his boring suggestions, but his silence cut me off. He laid her back in the crib, kissed her forehead, and walked past me without a word. His lack of anger unsettled me, far more than shouting ever would, because at least anger meant I could fight back, twist the narrative, and laugh at him for being paranoid. Silence gave me nothing to work with. I decided I couldn't let him control the mood of the house. I marched into the kitchen and started speaking loudly, telling him he had no right to sulk over a name. I told him if he really loved me, he would let it go, that he was letting his paranoia ruin what should be a joyful time. He sat at the table with a coffee, flipping through bills, and didn't look up once. I accused him of not caring about me, of being cold, of ignoring the effort I put into carrying and delivering our child. He finally looked up, and for a brief moment I thought he would argue, but he just slid a stack of documents to the side and left the room. The dismissal burned worse than words. Later that day, Naomi came over, and I poured out my frustration, telling her Tom had been sleeping in the nursery, that he barely looked at me, that he was treating me like a criminal. She reminded me that I had done nothing wrong, that names were just names, that Tom was paranoid and insecure. Her words gave me strength, so I texted him while he was at work, telling him Naomi agreed with me, that everyone thought he was being ridiculous. He didn't reply. Hours passed, and I sent more messages, accusing him of avoiding me, of running away from the truth. Still, no response. His silence grew heavier with each ignored message, and I told myself he was scared of admitting I was right. That evening, when he returned, he didn't join me in the living room. Instead, he went straight upstairs, closing the nursery door behind him. I shouted after him, saying he was brainwashing our daughter, keeping her away from me. He didn't answer. I stomped up the stairs, pounded on the door, demanding to see Clara. He opened it just enough to say I could see her, but not wake her, then closed it again, the latch clicking firmly. I called Naomi immediately, ranting about how controlling he was, how he was trying to paint me as unstable. She murmured comfort, but her tone carried hesitation I hadn't heard before. I brushed it off, insisting she was just tired, that she still believed me. A few days later, I received a call from the registry office. They confirmed Clara's full name for official documents, and when I hung up, I saw Tom standing in the hallway, holding a copy of the registry papers in his hand. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, his eyes hollow, then slipped the papers into his folder. My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile, asking if he wanted to frame it like I had. He walked away instead. That night, I peeked into his office and saw him printing something else. Pages of my old messages, screenshots from my phone. Panic fluttered in my chest, but I told myself he was bluffing, that no court would care about a name or some harmless texts. When Margaret called the next day, her voice was sharper than ever. She said Tom had been speaking with an attorney, that he was protecting Clara from growing up in a house built on lies. I snapped at her, accusing her of turning him against me, of poisoning his mind. She fired back that I had done that myself the moment I chose Adrian. Her words rang in my ears long after the call ended, though I told myself she was only trying to scare me. That evening, Tom slept in the guest room instead of the nursery, leaving Clara with a baby monitor beside him. I tried to confront him, asking if he was really planning to take legal action. He didn't answer directly, just said Clara deserved honesty and stability. I laughed bitterly, accusing him of dramatizing everything, insisting he was paranoid. But his calm tone, the way he quietly stacked papers into neat piles, unnerved me more than if he had shouted. It felt like watching someone build a case brick by brick while I stood outside the wall, pounding my fists against it. I called Naomi again, desperate for support. I told her Tom was preparing something, that he had gathered registry papers and messages. For the first time, she didn't immediately agree with me. She said softly that maybe he was serious, that maybe this wasn't just sulking. I snapped at her, demanding to know if she thought I had done something wrong. She hesitated too long before answering, and that hesitation burned. I accused her of betrayal, told her she was letting Tom manipulate her. She apologized weakly, but the doubt in her voice made me feel more alone than ever. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the living room and stared at the mantel where the framed copy of Clara's birth certificate still stood. The name Adrian glared back at me, black ink on white paper, unchangeable, undeniable. I whispered to myself over and over that it was just a name, nothing more, that Tom was paranoid, that everyone was exaggerating. But each repetition sounded weaker than the last. In the silence of the house, I heard the faint rustle of papers from Tom's office upstairs, and I realized he wasn't sulking anymore. He was planning. I decided that if Tom wanted to retreat into silence, then I would be the one to take control of the story. At the clinic, I started speaking more loudly whenever the topic of Clara came up, bragging about how beautiful her full name sounded, how much thought I had put into it, how people who criticized it were simply stuck in the past. I told co-workers that Tom was sulking over nothing, that he was so insecure he couldn't handle a simple choice. Some smiled politely, but I could see the judgment in their eyes, the whispers that followed me down the hallway. One afternoon, I overheard Melissa telling another nurse that it was cruel to name a baby after an ex, and my cheeks burned even though I forced myself to laugh. I claimed she was exaggerating, that people loved to invent drama, but deep down I knew the gossip was spreading faster than I could contain it. Naomi came by that evening, and I told her again how ridiculous Tom was being. I poured her a glass of wine and complained that he spent more time in his office than with me, that he had grown cold and distant. She nodded, but her laughter no longer rang as confidently as before. She asked quietly if maybe Tom had a point, if maybe using Adrian's name was a little unfair. Her words stung like a slap, and I snapped at her, demanding to know whose side she was on. She quickly backtracked, saying she only meant Tom was dramatic, but the hesitation in her voice planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. At the next family gathering, things spiraled further. I walked in with Clara on my hip, smiling as if nothing was wrong, ready to show everyone that I wasn't afraid. Tom was already there, quiet as always, helping his father set the table. Margaret wasted no time. She asked me in front of everyone if I was proud of what I had done, if I truly thought it was appropriate to give Clara the name of a man who wasn't her father. I laughed loudly, clapping my hands together, insisting that Adrian was a common name, that she was inventing drama to tear me down. Naomi tried to support me, adding that some families just love to control everything, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying her uncertainty. The room fell into heavy silence. Tom didn't speak, didn't look at me, didn't defend himself. He simply cut Clara's food into small pieces, helping her eat with quiet focus. I accused him of feeding Margaret lies, of turning his family against me, of trying to make me look like a monster. He still didn't reply, and the quiet was unbearable. I filled it with more laughter, louder, sharper, declaring that Tom was paranoid, that only insecure men acted this way. Margaret's face reddened with fury. Paul shook his head slowly, and Naomi looked down at her glass, as though she wished she wasn't there. Finally, Margaret's voice cut through the silence, saying I was cruel, that I had dishonored her son in public and thought I could laugh my way out of it. Her words were blunt, heavy, impossible to brush off. I shouted back that she had always hated me, that she was twisting things, that Tom was simply too weak to stand up for himself. Still, Tom didn't rise to the bait. He set his fork down gently, lifted Clara from her chair, and announced in a calm, steady voice that they were leaving. The calmness in his tone froze me in place. No anger, no shouting, just finality. He walked out without looking back, Clara resting peacefully against his shoulder. I tried to laugh again, insisting he was being dramatic, but even I could hear how forced it sounded. Naomi murmured that maybe I should let him cool off, but her words lacked conviction. Margaret leaned across the table, her eyes sharp, and told me that Tom didn't need to argue anymore, that the truth had already broken him. Her voice rang in my ears long after the dinner ended, long after I drove home with Naomi silent beside me. Back at my apartment, I ranted to Naomi that everyone was exaggerating, that Tom was manipulating them, that they were punishing me for nothing more than a name. She nodded weakly, but she didn't argue on my behalf the way she once had. When she finally left, her goodbye was short, distant, and I realized her loyalty was slipping away too. I sat alone, staring at the copy of Clara's birth certificate on the mantel, repeating to myself that Adrian was just a name, nothing more. But the silence of the empty apartment made the words sound brittle, hollow. The next morning at the clinic, I overheard Damien, one of Tom's friends who sometimes visited, talking with Melissa in the hallway. He said Tom had been gathering paperwork, that he had already spoken with a lawyer. My chest tightened, but I forced a smirk, walking past them as if their words didn't matter. Inwardly, though, panic began to spread. If Tom was really speaking to lawyers, then his silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I told myself no court would ever take Clara away from her mother. No judge would care about a middle name. Yet the image of Tom's calm face as he walked out with Clara haunted me. That night, the apartment felt colder than ever. I sat staring at the birth certificate again, the ink spelling out Clara Adrian Colvin, unchangeable, undeniable. I whispered to myself that it was only a name, that Tom was paranoid, that everyone else was wrong. But deep inside, I knew his silence was building into something I couldn't stop. The laughter I used as armor was beginning to sound like a weapon turned against me, and for the first time, I feared the calm look in his eyes more than Margaret's rage or the whispers at work. The day Tom finally acted, it wasn't with shouting or confrontation, but with paperwork delivered in a stiff envelope. I came home from the clinic and found it waiting on the kitchen counter, heavy and official, my name typed neatly on the front. My heart pounded as I tore it open, expecting some minor notice, maybe a bill or formality. Instead, I found legal documents, custody petitions, requests for financial control, evidence exhibits neatly labeled. My breath caught as I read the words, "In the best interest of the child," printed in bold at the top. He had gone to court. He had built a case. He had turned his silence into a weapon sharper than anything I had imagined. I stormed into his office, waving the papers in my hand, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry, just calm, steady, as if every move had been prepared long before. He said Clara deserved stability, that he couldn't let her grow up in a house where her own name was a reminder of lies. His lawyer had guided him, he explained, every step careful, every piece of evidence lined up like bricks in a wall. He had co-workers' statements, screenshots of my texts, copies of my posts where I mocked him publicly, even the teacher's report that Clara was already showing signs of withdrawal. He laid it all out in quiet tones, each word more devastating than any argument I had ever tried to win with laughter. I tried to fight back, insisting it was paranoia, that I had done nothing wrong, that a middle name couldn't possibly matter this much. I shouted that he was weak, that he was running to the courts because he couldn't handle a real marriage. He listened silently, and then handed me a stack of my own messages, my words to Naomi, bragging about how I had chosen Adrian just to see Tom squirm, mocking him for being too old-fashioned. My stomach dropped as I read my own handwriting, my own cruelty staring back at me in black and white. I tried to laugh, saying everyone joked with their friends, but even my own voice cracked under the weight of the evidence. When Margaret and Paul came by later, they didn't shout at me. Margaret's eyes were cold as she told me Tom was protecting Clara, not punishing me. Paul explained calmly that the documents were already filed, that the court would see through my excuses. I called them manipulative, controlling, desperate to turn Tom against me, but they simply shook their heads. Naomi came by too, but even she seemed uneasy now. She avoided my eyes when I begged her to back me up, muttering only that things had gone further than she expected. Her silence felt like betrayal, another crack in the foundation I thought I could lean on. At the custody hearing, Tom's lawyer spoke first, laying out every piece of evidence with precision. He described my behavior at work, the way I had bragged about humiliating my husband. He projected my text onto a screen, my words shining in the courtroom, impossible to deny. He showed screenshots of my social media posts, mocking Tom for being paranoid, laughing about vacation flings and fresh excitement. The teacher's report followed, describing Clara's withdrawn behavior, her reluctance to participate, her anxiety. Each document hit like a hammer, each phrase chipping away at the image I had tried to maintain. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to twist the narrative, claiming Tom was controlling, that he wanted to strip me of power, that he was punishing me for being independent. I said Adrian was a common name, that everyone was blowing things out of proportion, that no real harm had been done. But my voice sounded shrill, desperate, compared to Tom's calm delivery. My own lawyer fumbled, clearly struggling to counter the neat stack of evidence Tom had built. Every time I laughed or raised my voice, the judge's expression hardened, and I felt the balance tipping further against me. The final blow came when Tom spoke. He said he wasn't there to attack me, that he didn't want to strip me of rights, but that his duty was to Clara. He said he had endured humiliation, had been mocked and diminished, but he had stayed silent until the evidence showed Clara was suffering too. He spoke of love, of stability, of wanting his daughter to grow up without confusion or ridicule. His words were steady, measured, heartbreakingly reasonable. Listening to him, I realized that my laughter, my dismissals, my accusations, all of it sounded hollow in comparison to the quiet strength of his resolve. When the judge announced temporary custody arrangements, my chest tightened. Tom would have primary custody, with me allowed supervised visitation until a final decision could be reached. He would control the finances tied to Clara's care, ensuring her needs were met without relying on me. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. The ruling had been made, and I could only sit there, staring at the papers I had once dismissed as meaningless. Back home, the apartment felt emptier than ever. The framed birth certificate still sat on the mantel, Clara's name glaring back at me. Adrian, in bold black ink, the choice I had laughed about, the joke I thought would prove my independence. Now it felt like a curse, a word that had unraveled everything I had built. I poured a glass of wine, whispering again that it was just a name, just a joke, nothing more. But the court documents on the table told another story, and Tom's calm voice echoed in my head, steady and undeniable. The final hearing came faster than I expected, though in truth I had been counting the days with a mix of dread and defiance. I walked into the courthouse, determined to wear confidence like armor, telling myself again and again that Tom was paranoid, that no judge could possibly side with him over something as trivial as a name. Yet when I saw him sitting there, calm and steady, papers neatly stacked before him, my stomach knotted. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't nervous. He looked like a man who had already accepted the outcome, as if he knew the truth would carry him through. I smirked, trying to convince myself it meant he was overconfident, but a small voice inside whispered that it meant he had already won. The judge began by reviewing the evidence, a process that felt endless as document after document was read aloud. Statements from co-workers who described my laughter at Tom's expense. Screenshots of texts where I bragged about choosing Adrian as a deliberate jab. My social media posts, displayed for everyone to see, mocking him in public spaces. The teacher's report about Clara's withdrawn behavior, her hesitation in class, her anxiousness. Each piece stacked neatly against me, my own words and actions, forming a wall I couldn't climb over. My lawyer tried to argue that none of it proved unfitness, that it was exaggerated, but compared to Tom's clear, measured evidence, his defense sounded weak. When it was my turn to speak, I launched into my performance. I claimed Tom was controlling, that he had twisted every detail to punish me, that I had only been joking, that names were meaningless. I insisted the world was overreacting, that Margaret had poisoned everyone's mind against me, that I was the victim of paranoia. I even laughed loudly at one point, trying to prove I wasn't shaken, but the sound echoed hollowly in the quiet courtroom, brittle and sharp. The judge didn't laugh. Tom didn't flinch. Even Naomi, who had come reluctantly, avoided my eyes from the gallery. For the first time, I felt the hollowness of my own defense pressing in around me. Tom spoke last, and his words sealed everything. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't list my faults with venom. He simply said, Clara deserved a safe, stable home free of games and cruelty. He said he had stayed silent through his own humiliation, but he could not stay silent once it affected his daughter. He said a child should not grow up carrying the shadow of betrayal stitched into her very name. His voice was steady, his tone reasonable, and in contrast, I sounded like a storm raging without purpose. His words were not angry, they were resolute. They painted me as reckless without him ever needing to use the word. The ruling was delivered that afternoon. Tom was granted full custody, with me allowed only limited visitation under supervision until I could demonstrate stability. Financial control shifted to him, ensuring Clara's needs would always be met. The birth certificate remained unchanged, but the irony was clear. The name I had chosen to mock Tom had become the anchor of the case that stripped me of control. I felt the ground tilt beneath me as the judge's words sank in, each one a nail sealing the fate I had once laughed at. I walked out of the courtroom in a daze, my lawyer trailing behind me with a look of quiet pity. Outside, Tom stood with Clara in his arms, Margaret at his side, Paul nearby. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even glance my way with triumph. He kissed Clara's forehead, handed Margaret a diaper bag, and walked away. His calmness was unbearable. It meant he didn't need revenge, because dignity had returned to him in the most public way. My laughter, my dismissal, my endless claims of paranoia had turned into the very evidence that broke me. Back at my apartment, the silence felt suffocating. The framed copy of Clara's birth certificate still sat on the mantel, the middle name Adrian glaring back at me like a curse I had written with my own hand. I poured a glass of wine, whispering again that it was just a name, just a harmless choice, nothing more. But the empty crib in the nursery told the truth. Clara wasn't there. Tom had her, legally, permanently, with the court's blessing. My words no longer mattered, my laughter no longer echoed. The silence Tom had carried for weeks now filled every corner of the apartment, heavy and final. I sat on the couch, staring at the papers spread across the table, the judge's signature at the bottom, undeniable and permanent. I told myself he had overreacted, that everyone had exaggerated, that I hadn't done anything truly wrong. Yet, even as I repeated it, the words lost strength, fading into whispers swallowed by the silence. The truth was clear, etched into documents I could not erase. I had laughed too loudly, mocked too often, and believed too deeply in my own twisted logic. Tom had chosen the law over fury, patience over chaos, and in doing so, he had won everything. The apartment grew darker as the evening set in, the walls closing in with the weight of what I had lost. I clutched the certificate in my hands, the ink smudging beneath my fingers, and for the first time, the name Adrian didn't feel elegant or clever. It felt like a mistake carved into stone, the joke that had cost me my family. The silence pressed harder, the kind that couldn't be filled with laughter or excuses. It was the silence of a door closed, of dignity reclaimed, of a story ended without me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.